Everyone, welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. How are you all doing? I am so excited for today's episode. We are going to have a really good discussion about animism and paganism and how they're similar, how they're different. I'm excited to hear all of your opinions on this topic. And then we're going to do a thought experiment and think about what the world might be like if we adopted a more animist worldview and philosophy. So a lot to cover today. Before we get started, if you are new here, welcome. This is the 33rd episode, I believe, of Pagan Happy Hour. I do these every Friday at 5 p.m. Central as a way to connect and chat with you all about different pagan topics. So if that sounds like your jam and you're not yet subscribed, go ahead and do that. There are two main ways you can support the show. I do run a Discord community through my Patreon. So if you are looking for a community of fellow pagans to chat with and share resources, I have the link for my Patreon down below where you can access the Discord. And the other great way to support the show is through the Super Chat feature. So I'm going to be looking at your comments as we're going throughout the happy hour. I'm going to be bringing in your thoughts and ideas. A lot of times the comments move pretty quick. So if you want to ensure that I do see your comment or question so that I can bring it into the conversation, you can use Super Chats, which is the $ at the bottom of the chat window. And of course, it's another great way to support the show. So now that we got that out of the way, I want to hear from you guys where you're from and what you're drinking this evening. Let me put on the drink music and let me know in the chat what you're up to. So I'm just having some red wine today. Let me check your comments here. Let's see, I see we have someone from Romania. That's cool. Northern California, Milwaukee, Hungary, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, the UK, Illinois. It looks like we are from all over. Welcome, guys. This is going to be so fun. I love chatting with you all each week. So let's jump into it. Let me turn off the drink music. And let's chat about paganism and animism. And this is a topic I've been wanting to cover. And I should first start out by mentioning I am not a professional anthropologist. I don't have a degree in religious studies. So do please take what I say with a grain of salt. I am not an expert by any means. But animism is something that has always been fascinating to me. And I've been curious on where it fits in with paganism, because I think that's a really interesting question. And it's something that us modern pagans should really consider. So that's what we're going to go over today. But I think first we kind of have to define what paganism and animism is so that we can better understand how they're similar and different. So let's start with paganism. I know many of you watching probably consider yourself pagan, as I do. So paganism, it comes from a Latin term. Pagan means like rural or rustic, basically. And it's a term that was used kind of pejoratively. Starting around the 4th century by early Christians in the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire transitioned into predominantly a Christian empire. So it was used to kind of refer to the people that were still practicing the ancient Roman polytheist religion. They would call them pagan, meaning the rural folk, basically. And in the time of the Roman Empire, the people that were considered part of this pagan class were kind of increasingly rural, just because, when the Roman Empire transitioned into a Christian world, you kind of had to convert to Christianity if you wanted any power or status within the city. So those that held on to their polytheist beliefs the longest were often those in the rural fringes of the empire. So eventually, paganism kind of became known as the religion of the peasants or the religion of the rural people, which in my view, even though it was intended to be a like pejorative title, I guess, I think that's kind of awesome. I don't mind being called rural or rustic or even like part of the non-elite. Like I'm fine with that. So I still use the term pagan proudly. I know some pagans don't like using that term because of its history, but for me, I don't mind too much. So that's kind of, where the term paganism comes from. And of course, it's evolved and changed throughout time, just as in ancient Rome, the followers of the ancient Roman religion wouldn't be calling themselves pagan. So, they were just, people who practiced their religion. There wasn't even like a term for it necessarily. That was just the way things were. It's only when other religions entered into the picture that there needed to be a term for those that honored the pagan gods. So that's kind of where the pagan term comes from. And to me as well, I don't think of paganism as just a religion or a spirituality. I think it's both a religion and a lifestyle or a philosophy or worldview. And to me, it's this worldview is all based on the celebration and appreciation of nature. As you'll notice with not just my channel, but many different pagan resources out there, we talk a lot about the holidays. And to me, the holidays are key to what it means to kind of be a pagan. It's to notice those moments in the wheel of the year, to honor them, to respect the changing cycles. And that's kind of a huge part of at least my worldview and how I celebrate paganism is through recognizing these cycles. And the concept of cycles is something I've talked about previously. I made a whole video on my channel a while back about pagan cycles. But in general, all of our symbolism, everything we celebrate is kind of based around this idea of cycles, renewal. Of course, life, death, rebirth, that's a big one. And the wheel of the year, of course, being a huge thing in paganism. We celebrate and recognize the changes in the wheel of the year. But even when you look at our rituals themselves, they are often in a circle, right? We stand in a circle. It's not a rigid hierarchy like in other religions. We're all kind of equal by celebrating our faith in a circle. Of course, I'm talking here a bit more about modern paganism. I know in ancient paganism, there was a hierarchical structure in many of the religions, but I still think this concept of being in tuned with the cycles of nature is a key component to paganism and has been since the beginning. And this is going to kind of tie into now as we start thinking and talking about animism, because of course, with animism, we're going to dive into that idea even more. But before we do, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about all that or that definition of paganism? Do you think of it as just a religion or a faith, or do you view it both as a lifestyle? How would you personally define paganism? Because I was just using the definitions, kind of historically, where this term comes from. But our modern paganism is very difficult to define because we are so varied in our beliefs and practices as a community. So I'd like to hear in the comments how you define paganism. And let me take a sip of my drink here, and I'm going to see what you guys say for a second. Let's see. Cassidy says a religion and a lifestyle for sure. Let's see. Vanessa also agrees both a faith and a lifestyle. Graves says paganism is a way to look at the world. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Let's see. Great comments, guys. John says it's a way of life. Mykola says, I am drawn to both connection with natural forces like snow or animals and plants and perceive them towards human characteristics you can build in yourself. Yeah, I definitely like that idea. Ava says it's both faith and lifestyle as a polytheistic and animistic worldview. Let's see. Anita says paganism for me is a religion and a lifestyle, and animism is a huge part of it. Light of Belena says, I think like Buddhism, it can be experienced as a religion, a philosophy, and a lifestyle. And Alexandra says, it's a total way of life. There's no element in my life that isn't impacted by it. I personally practice on a solitary basis, so religion is far away from my mindset. Awesome. Great comments, guys. You guys are really on top of things this evening. And I totally feel the way many of you do. Paganism has touched pretty much all parts of my life. I view it so much as a philosophical approach to how I interact with the world and the divine and interact with just my day-to-day life, my philosophy towards life. It informs my morality and how I interact with others and the environment. So to me, paganism is so core to who I am because it interfaces with so many different aspects of my life. But now we need to think about animism. And animism is something that just isn't really taught in schools very much, which is odd, in my opinion, considering for the vast majority of human history, we were all animists, right? Pretty much every society and culture around the world started with animist beliefs. So I think it's key and critical to the development of humanity as a whole. It's what we all started with. So I think in that way, it's foundational to the human experience. Regardless of what religion you might be, we all started out as animists in a lot of ways. So, but first we kind of need to decide what animism is. So the term animism, like paganism, it's coming from a Latin word. And in this case, the Latin word is anima, which kind of translates towards breath or spirit or life. So we're starting out pretty good, right? Animism, in my view, is basically the belief that objects, places, and creatures, everything, all possesses a spiritual essence. And so animists perceive that all things, whether they're animals, plants, rocks, rivers, they are all alive and animated, right? That's where that term animism comes from, thinking things are animated, they're alive in some way. Sure, they may be different. They may not be experiencing the world in the same way we do, or have a consciousness that is exactly the same as how we view consciousness, but they're still alive and still capable of experiencing the world around them. And animism as kind of a faith, it can kind of be considered the etiquette of the relationship between human beings and non-human beings in a way that kind of can appease the gods and to restore and maintain the harmony in the world. And the key part of that concept is the relationship between the human beings and the non-human beings. So that phrase, non-human beings, right? You're still considering them on the same, in the same way you would consider a human being. They're not human, but they're still a being, right? They're still alive. And because they are still alive, they deserve our respect. And animists, it's important to maintain that respect and that relationship with everything in the world, because maintaining that relationship ensures that there will be harmony in the world as a whole. So that's kind of how I would define animism and how I've kind of looked up different sources on how they define it. But again, just like paganism, there are a lot of variations here on this concept and how people define it. So, animism is also kind of a term used in anthropology a lot. I took some anthro courses back in college, so I'm trying to dig back in my brain here. But it's used in studying the anthropology of religion, and it's often a term used for the belief system of many indigenous peoples, and especially as a contrast from recent more. So it's kind of used as this contrast point. You have Islam, or the religion of indigenous peoples, and then you have organized religion over here. And that viewpoint that you often find in, anthropological texts, I find it a bit confusing and kind of problematic, because how do you define an organized religion, right? And where does paganism fit in that structure? So if on the one hand you have animism and then you have organized religion, what is paganism? Is paganism an indigenous religion? Is it a organized religion? Is it somewhere in between? Where do we fit in this kind of worldview? And part of that's kind of tricky, because paganism itself has changed and evolved over time. Back in, say, ancient Rome or ancient Greece or ancient Egypt, I would have considered their religion an organized religion, right? They had a structure of priests and temples and a lot of rules and traditions that were being practiced. It was very organized. But that organization kind of fell apart as Christianity advanced more and more, and other religions did as well, kind of toppling the organization part of the religion, till eventually, much later, in the modern era, people started to bring paganism back, and become modern pagans. But as a modern pagan movement, are we an organized religion? Not really. So are we more than akin to an animist on the animist side here? Where do we fit? Which I think is such a fascinating question. Are we an indigenous religion? Are we an organized religion? Where do we fall within this spectrum? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because I think it's a really interesting question. And I know there's all this kind of debate about, like, is paganism an indigenous religion or not? And I'm not going to get into that debate, but I think it's interesting to look at it from a historical perspective, how paganism evolved from, in many cases it was an indigenous religion and it was an organized religion. And then it changed, and what are we now? Let me know your thoughts here while I have a sip. Let's see, Fernando has a great definition of animism. He says that animism is experiencing the wonders of the world by seeing the magical in the mundane. I love that. Let's see. Cassidy says, I feel like we're closer to animism than organized. I kind of agree there. Let's see. Joanna says, I remember believing in animism as a kid, even though I had no idea it existed. Yeah, I think children and the children's stories that are so inherently magical and feature magic mountains and streams and spirits in nature, I think there's something deep there that it's hitting at, that our child selves immediately connect with an animistic worldview. And maybe that gets pushed out, perhaps, as we grow older. I think that's really interesting. Let's see. Alexandra says, paganism is way too diverse a concept to be an organized religion. It's why I love it so much. And Lynn says, down with dogma. Peach says, a movement, a renaissance. Yeah, great points there. Paganism, right now, we're not really an organized religion. There was kind of a more movement, not so much among my generation, but more like the baby boomers and maybe even Gen X for a while. We're really trying to put paganism at the seat with the other big religions. They were really working towards getting paganism recognized and on a level field with these other world religions. And I think a lot of younger pagans aren't as interested in that. I think a lot of younger pagans are okay with not having a seat at that table and instead remaining outsiders. And I'm not sure I want paganism to become an organized religion or to have a hierarchy or a dogma. I talked about this in several other pagan happy hours. It's really tough because on the one hand, we won't ever be a movement with power to make big change if we don't organize very well. But at the same time, a lot of the reason we're here, the reason we find this faith and spirituality meaningful is because it allows us freedom from structure and hierarchy and dogma. And you don't want to take that away because that's why we're all here. So yeah, great thoughts there. Let's see. Newton has an interesting question asking, is animism a closed practice? I've heard it is, and I'm very confused how a belief can be closed. Any insight? So that ties into the concept that when you say animism, often you're referring to indigenous religions that are still practiced today. And it's going to be different based on which indigenous religion you're talking about. So, for example, the Native American religions are an indigenous religion that animism features very prominently. I would probably describe those religions as animist. Those are pretty much considered closed religions because there are people alive right now who are practicing them, and it's up to them to basically decide if they want to, let people into their religious group or the religious faith. And in many cases, many indigenous religious people choose not to. So in that case, it's kind of closed, but you have other indigenous religions that aren't as closed. For example, I've always been very fascinated with Shintoism. Shintoism is the indigenous animist religion of Japan. They have they're not quite fully unorganized. They do kind of, have organization. I mean, there's temples, there's a structure of priests and everything like that, but it's very open in the sense that you can definitely be Shinto, you can go to the temples, you can pray, you can interact with the religion, and it's a bit more open. I was lucky enough to attend a Shinto wedding a couple years ago of two of my friends. I went to Tokyo for that wedding, and it was so amazing and wonderful to see what a animist Shinto wedding ceremony was like. So it's different depending on what religion. Now, paganism is confusing because it was indigenous back in the day, right? It was once upon a time indigenous to all these different cultures, right? Paganism was all over the world, and it was different based on cultures. While all those pagan religions shared certain similarities, they were all viewing their religion from their own cultural lens. So they were at one point indigenous religions. Most of them weren't considered closed religions at the time. In fact, they were very syncretic. You can look at Alexandria, Egypt for an example of that, where they were really into fusing the Greco-Roman deities with the Egyptian deities, creating combo deities. It was very much like a melting pot of religion. But everything changed, right? So once mostly Christianity came in and put a stop to paganism as it was practiced in the classical world, then it was no longer an indigenous religion. It was no longer a syncretic religion. It kind of fell apart for a while and was just practiced mostly in private, not always among the rural people, kind of going back to that original definition of paganism. They were the ones who preserved the festivals, who preserved the honoring of the gods. And eventually, over time, Christianity took pieces of the pagan faiths into their own religion, which is why so many Christian holidays are based on pagan traditions and pagan festivals. So then you look at paganism nowadays. Paganism nowadays isn't a closed religion. It's pretty open. Anyone can practice paganism, but we are inspired by these ancient religions. So we're taking inspiration. We're not able to pull them from the earth and resurrect them as they were. We just don't know that much, nor would we necessarily want to resurrect everything from these ancient pagan religions. But that's why it makes it so complicated to answer a question like that. Like, where does paganism fit in this? Because it's evolved and changed so much over time, and it's vastly different depending on what culture you're looking at, what time period you're looking at. So yeah, I don't have all the answers here, but I think these are great discussions to have. Let's see. Just checking your comments here before we move on. Let's see. Let me just check here. Mikola has an interesting statement. I think pagans tend to not want to agree that it's a religion because they grew up calling religion Christianity and found paganism much later and couldn't rectify the definition in their minds. Yeah, a lot of pagans come from Christian backgrounds, and we have a lot of baggage from that. Mm-hmm. Erica has a funny question. Is Marie Kondo an animist? If you don't know who Marie Kondo is, she's a minimalist, and she talks about minimalism. She had her own Netflix series. I personally am a bit of a minimalist myself. And I think she is Shinto. She worked as a shrine maiden for a while, and her animist worldview interacts with how she looks at stuff. So one of the very animist things she does when she's decluttering is to give thanks to the object before, getting rid of it, thanking it for the service it has provided. And to me, that's just kind of very beautiful, very animist way to look at the things around us, the things that we have in our lives. So that's a funny question. But yeah, that was great. Let's see. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Let's see. Okay. Now, the next question that I think is interesting is, where does animism fit in modern day paganism? Now, if we look at kind of the timeline of religion here. So I talked about how at one time, all humans were basically animist. From the earliest of humans, you can look at the Lascaux cave paintings, or really any of the prehistoric cave paintings, show key indicators of animist beliefs. So we all started there. And so all of our concepts of gods and spirits and the divine was centered around the earth and the universe. It was life that was predominantly sacred and celebrated. And as we notice today, there are still many people following animist religions, like Shinto, for example, or the Native American religions. Then eventually, animism evolves into paganism in many different, but not all, societies. Now, paganism often still include a worship of the natural world. Many different pagan religions have land spirits and nature spirits. Like Norse paganism, for example, the nature spirits are very integral to the faith. But then it's expanded where you start having more gods and goddesses that are up above. And eventually that becomes full pantheons. So you can start to see this kind of general progression here. We started as fully connected to finding the divinity in the earth itself and viewing it as a living being. And then with paganism and ancient pagan societies, most of them started adding on gods and goddesses. And over time, they started getting their own stories and their own folklore, and it evolved into huge epics that were written and full pantheons of many different gods and goddesses. And while the earth was still really important and often viewed as an actual goddess like Gaia, it wasn't always the main central aspect behind the celebration of the faith. It was still part of it. The cycles of the year, the wheel of the year was still celebrated in these ancient pagan societies, but the gods and the goddesses started to take more of the attention, right? And then eventually we have monotheism come in, which fully separates things. So on up here, you have the gods, the one God. And then you have the other stuff down here, but you have humans. Humans are more important than all the nature. So, God made man in his image. So God is the most important. Humans are the second most important. And then you have everything else below that. And you lose the spiritual essence of the natural world once you get to that point. So it's really changed a lot. But then you have us modern pagans, like you and me, living in the 21st century, and we take inspiration from the ancient pagan world. We bring in their traditions, their festivals, their beliefs. But I think one of the unique things about us modern pagans is we also, for the most part, really take in that connection with nature. That often when I talk to other people on how they found paganism, why they're pagan, a lot of times it's not because they heard a god or goddess calling to them, or they felt immediately connected to the gods or goddesses. It's because since they were a child, they found something spiritually significant and important in the natural world. And that led them to question modern religions, and that eventually led to them learning about paganism. And because paganism is often more well known than animism and is often easier to kind of join in, that's how many pagans that I've spoken to kind of ended up here. We knew deep down that there was some type of spiritual importance to the natural world, and we felt more connected with it than a single God up in the heavens looking down on us and dictating our life. So I think that modern paganism really takes animism and brings it in to our modern pagan beliefs, potentially even a little more than some historic pagan societies would have done. And it's different, not every pagan is the same, of course, but for me personally, I consider animism a part of my pagan beliefs and my pagan practice. In fact, I kind of view it as foundational to how I spiritually connect with the world. But do you need to be animist in order to be pagan? Do you need to include animism? Maybe not. And this is something, I did a poll earlier today on my YouTube community page asking this very question. What is the relationship between paganism and animism? Is it foundational to paganism, or can you be pagan without being animist? And you guys voted, and it was almost equal. It was almost 50-50. Slightly more of you think that you can, in fact, be pagan without being animist than consider animism foundational to paganism. But I think that's really interesting that we're kind of 50-50 here. And I'd like to hear from you guys in the comments what your thoughts are on this. Do you consider animist belief part of your faith, and why or why not? So definitely let me know in the comments while I have a sip of my wine. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. It's still very much forming in my mind. I don't have this kind of like solid, fully fleshed out yet, but I just know deep down that like animism is an important part of my faith, and I think it will continue to be. But let me hear what you guys think. Jenna says that animism is just the foundation of her pagan beliefs. Yeah, definitely agree there. Let's see, what else do you guys think? Mykola says maybe pagans are organized animists. That's an interesting idea or way to look at it, for sure. Let's see. Rachel says, it's kind of confusing for me. I tend to honor creatures and plants and trees, but don't think of rocks and water, etc., as having spirits. Let's see. Marissa says, I definitely have some aspects of animism that I believe in, like everything having its own spirit. And Ron says, animism definitely was foundational, but paganism feels like it can now stand on its own. King Axel says, I do, but I can understand why people would see nature as what it is. Light of Belena says, I would see animism as a core component of my Norse and Celtic paganism. Me too. I mostly follow the Norse and Celtic paths, and those two pagan paths tend to be ones that really do incorporate a lot of animist beliefs. Let's see. Emily says, I am definitely an animist. It has changed the way I interact with the world. I started out more with learning different gods and goddesses, but reattached to nature, and that has become the main part of what I do. And let's see, one more comment here. I consider myself an animist, but as I don't recognize deities per se, I don't think I can consider myself pagan. Yeah, so I think you can definitely be animist without being pagan, and you could probably be pagan without being animist. But in my view, they work really well when you mesh them together. So next, I want to kind of think about for a moment what the world would be like if we were more animist, if more people in the world adopted an animist, not even faith, just maybe an animist worldview to a certain extent. Because I think a huge shifting in what is and is not important would occur. In animist societies, it's life that is important. It's the world. It's the ground we're standing on. It's the planet that is so important. And in the Abrahamic societies, the earth is not as important as the heavens, right? In Abrahamic viewpoint, we exist and we are trying during this life to keep our souls pure. And if we succeed at that, when we die, we will go up to heaven. And it doesn't so much matter what happens here as long as we keep our individual souls pure. So that's a very different worldview, right? And right now in the world, while yes, there are still many animists out there are still pagans out there are still many different religions. I didn't even mention Hinduism, which is another ancient religion that does have many animist components. Even Buddhism has some animist components. But for the most part, the countries that have the most power in our modern world are often defined by these monotheistic main religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So the focus in these religions is not on celebrating the spiritual essence of the earth itself, but the focus is on maintaining our own individual pure souls so that we can ascend to the heavens or the higher realm. Now, those are two vastly different viewpoints. And I think it's interesting to think about how the world would be different if we had stayed animists. We were once all animists. What would have happened if we stayed animists or even, became pagan, but like paganism still includes a lot of aspects of animism? How would the world look different? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. What do you guys think before I jump into my own 2 cents? So let me see what your thoughts are. Emily says, we would be caring for the land and the vegetation to combat the droughts and have the water we could actually swim in and see the bottom of. Yes, definitely. That connection, when I talked about animism being the etiquette of the relationship between human and non-human beings, I think animists obviously would probably not be polluting these sacred waterways as we do now. Let's see. Beth says every tree, plant, and animal and parts of land would be more deeply respected. Yep, I definitely agree. Light of Belena says, I also think that animism offers a greater sense of connection to everything around us. Abrahamic religions are fundamentally dualistic. This allows you to always brand something other as evil. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. Let me see what you guys think. Elvis says, we would probably be taking better care of the world. Rachel says, humans are selfish and feel like we can lord over other creatures. So I feel like we would still do that, even though we believe everything has spirit. Yeah, that's possible. Humans do have a lot of faults, that's for sure. Let's see. King Axel has an interesting point. I don't think we would have anywhere near as many technological advancements. That's an interesting point that I hadn't thought of. And I think you're probably right. If we were an animist society, exploiting the natural resources in a way that allows us to collect all the rare earth minerals and needed for computers and things like that, that at least wouldn't be happening to the degree that it is now. We wouldn't be able to exploit these natural resources to the extent that we are doing. Let's see. Fernando says, if we stayed animists, we would not consider exploration of the world as progress. Yeah, the whole concept of progress would probably be different. If animists are viewing the world in a more cyclical way of, these cycles within nature, but also, life and death and rebirth, the idea of progress for progress sake or growth for growth's sake doesn't fit an animist narrative because it's all about maintaining harmony and balance in the natural world. So yes, that's a great point. There's a lot there to consider. Let's see. Anita says, if more people were animist, we could easily stop climate change. Yep, I agree with that. Jason has an interesting comment. I heard religions or people were animists until agriculture came into place, where people started to view the sacred beyond the wild. Oops, I lost it. Since nature was no longer the source of our food, but a threat to our food source. Yeah, that's a good point, thinking about the establishment of agriculture and how that shifted our religious worldviews. There's definitely something there. Another book I would recommend is Ishmael, which is one of those like top 5 books that like changed my worldview on everything. It basically asks the question, did humanity make a mistake by leaving hunter-gatherer society and starting agriculture? What would our world would have looked like? And it's a fascinating question to ask, one that I had never thought of until I had read that book. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're curious on that question. Let's see. Interesting. Here's a question here. Why is Japan, despite being animist, still exploiting nature? Good question. And I think that, animist isn't the solution to necessarily all of the world's problems. We still live in a capitalist society where the definition of capitalism is that growth has to occur. So even though Japan may have a lot of animist aspects to its culture, it's still operating within a capitalist global system, right? So it probably can't fully be animist. Maybe it shouldn't be. And that's a tension there. In our modern economic system, we can't fully be an animist society because they're kind of at odds to each other, right? There's another great book. I actually did link this one down below. This book, I finished it in 2 days. I was obsessed. It like changed my mind on a lot of things. It's Less is More, How Degrowth Will Change the World. It's by Jason Hickel. And he talks about animism, but his primary argument is that we need to enter a post-capitalist or post-growth society, that we're never going to solve the climate crisis in time, that we need to start rethinking our entire economic system, which is kind of a wild thought there. Take it with a grain of salt. But he talks a lot about what adopting an animist world would be like and what would need to change with our current system, and how the concept of constant growth is inherently unsustainable. So really fascinating book. Highly recommend. The link for Amazon that I had down there, for some reason the book's really expensive on Amazon. I don't know why. I got my copy from the library, so I recommend doing that if you can't find a cheaper copy. But highly recommend that book. Highly recommend Ishmael. All of these questions I think are really important for us, for millennials like myself, and especially if there are any Gen Z watching, because we are in a chaotic time. And I wonder if we're going to be able to make the changes that need to be made in order to save the planet without adopting a more spiritual connection to the natural world. So maybe animism is something that inherently kind of needs to happen before people start taking these issues seriously, because right now they're really not. And you really can't take these issues seriously when you're basing everything on a system that relies entirely on perpetual growth. So these are questions that aren't just for today, but they are questions that I'll be experiencing for the rest of my life, and Gen Z is really going to be dealing with, as well as we, rub up against all of these huge climate issues. We're going to run out of water, resources, everything. How do we challenge that? How do we change that? How do we prevent that? And perhaps animism is not the whole key, but maybe it's a piece of it. Maybe if people started to view the world as alive. And this isn't just hippy dippy stuff. Like, scientists are starting to come around on this idea too, like the Gaia hypothesis, which is that the Earth itself is one big ecosystem, that it is kind of conscious as an ecosystem. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And you can look at studies that have been done about ecosystems and how they're all interconnected, like how recently there was a fascinating report about what happens when you introduce a predator into an ecological environment. In this case, it was reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone, and how it changed the entire ecology of the area. The rivers changed course, like, because the predator is eating certain animals that eat other animals that eat other animals. And so everything is all inherently connected. And right now in our worldview, we separate things. We have humans and nature. And to an animist, the word nature doesn't make sense, right? Because it's what we're in, it's all around us. It's not something separate. It's not human world and nature world. It's all together. So I kind of think we need to start thinking in more of that way. We need to start thinking in terms of ecosystems instead of like resources that are being extracted, or even in terms of individual species, because it's all interconnected in this web. So animism is something that I think people aren't talking about it now, but I think more people are going to be. And I want to hear your thoughts on this, because I just did a bit of a ramble. So let me hear your thoughts on this. Of course, again, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert by any means. Let's see. Let's see. Mark is saying, we will save the planet. However, governments are looking for more control. Mykola says, capitalism is literally just trading goods and services. Corruption of capitalism by tax exemption is what needs to be pursued. Okay, let's see. Someone says, the bread-pilled witch says, agree, capitalism and animism contradict each other. Let's see. Emily is saying, I'm so with that rethinking our capitalist society thing. It has destroyed our planet, and now we are all indentured servants to corporations. I definitely feel that way. Let's see. Let me see. Jenna says, I feel like us millennials, we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Yeah, definitely agree. We're in a tough bind here. Let's see. Just reading your thoughts here. Edward Tone says, Jane Goodall touches on this a bit in her writings. Oh, that sounds interesting. I should look into that. Let's see. Marissa says, I always think it's cool when science and paganism line up like that. I think the Gaia theory is super cool, and I will be researching more into it. Let's see. Light of Belena says, if you look at the good point made earlier about humans changing their perspective post-agriculture, I think we will adopt a greener spiritual significance in nature in response to climate change. I hope so. Let's see. Okay. Beth says, mindful consumption has been a result of the environmentalist movement. In turn, I've become a minimalist, buying less, being very mindful on what I consume and where it comes from. Yeah, that's a huge part of why I've adopted a more minimalist lifestyle, though I know inherently me just myself making changes isn't going to save the planet. We really need a lot more to happen. But it's something little that I personally find makes my life a little bit easier, and it's better for the world. So yeah, I'm enjoying it so far on my own little minimalist journey. Let's see. Terry is mentioning fungi and how they are a very vast network and how it's all interconnected. Very interesting to see how this works. And yeah, I've been reading a lot about fungus and the mycelium network that exists between trees. And this is neat too. Like if we're talking animism and, plants having consciousness, trees definitely fit into this story. And before I get into the tree thing, we do have our first super chat from Peach. Thank you so much for your support. She's mentioning that rocks have energy and power, maybe not consciousness, but some believe they store information. I think that's interesting, even from a scientific aspect, on how we have a lot of rocks or minerals in our technology. So I think there really is something there. And I think it's very possible that rocks have their own sense of experiencing the world around them. It's just not in the same way we do. So great comment, Peach. And you go up a level and think about like trees. Trees do really communicate through the fungal networks beneath the ground. So these fungal networks are huge. They span miles in some cases, and trees really do talk to one another, just in a different way. Like for example, if a mother tree, so it has a little seedling down here, and it can feel through the fungal network. It can get indicators that tree, their little baby tree, might be struggling, and it'll send nutrients there. Or if there is a tree that is struggling, maybe it has a lot of aphids or some disease, a bit further out, it will send a signal through the fungal network through the other trees and tell them, hey, you got to toughen up, you got to preserve your resources because there's potential disease coming or even fire. So the trees are really communicating to each other in this network, and it's not just the same species. They'll communicate to other species as well. So the trees themselves are talking to each other, and I think that's fascinating, and that's what I'm talking about. You can look at animism and still believe in science. There's so much there. Oh my goodness, Leonard has given me a super chat. Thank you so much, Leonard. That's very generous. He says, for the untold hours researching and editing, the ancient ancestors wanted to thank you for remembering them and said to buy you a well-earned drink. Bravo. Well, thank you so much, Leonard. Cheers. I really appreciate that support. I love doing the research for these Pagan Happy Hours. They are so fun to do with you all. I love chatting with you all. And I, like many of you, don't know many other pagans in real life. So this is really my opportunity to have these discussions, and to hear your thoughts and your ideas and see where we all stand on some of these questions. Let's see. Jason has a good question here. Let's see. He says, if all things are alive, how do you feel about eating animals? And that's something, to consider. And there are many animists or people that have animist worldviews that are vegetarian. For example, Hinduism and Buddhism incorporate some animist beliefs, and they are vegetarian. Though when you look at the indigenous cultures, most of them were not vegetarian, yet they're still animist. So just because you respect and find spiritual essence in everything, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't eat the animal. It means that you are maintaining the harmony of the natural world as a whole. So yes, you can still eat that one fish. But what you can't do is anything that would disrupt the harmony of the stream, which would be taking a ton of fish so that they couldn't reproduce effectively. So animists in indigenous cultures are actually highly intelligent on knowing how much you can take without disrupting the harmony. And this is a skill that our ancestors very much had. They knew how much caribou to kill to sustain themselves, but they knew not to do too much because that would affect them being able to hunt the caribou next year. So they were very aware of the regenerative aspects of the animal world and were sure not to take too much, because if you took too much one year, that would mean to starvation next year. So thinking about our world in that perspective, it totally fits in. Yes, we can use resources. We can use lumber to build our houses. We can fish in the streams. We can mine minerals, but we can only do so to an extent that doesn't disrupt the overall harmony. We can't do more than our earth can regenerate. So yeah, you don't need to be a vegetarian or a vegan to be an animist. There are some animists that are vegetarian or vegan, but historically, many animists were not. And they focused more on how do you maintain that harmony within the natural world. And also giving respect to the animals that you did consume. So many of the religious ceremonies incorporated animal masks or inhabiting the spirit of the animals. So we are honoring these animal spirits and how they have provided for us. So it's that respect that you're giving for the animal world as well. And that's why these rituals were so important, because that was the way that people can give that respect. So yeah, that's my view on it. Let's see. Let me check your thoughts here. Rachel asks, kind of on a similar vein, what is your opinion on pasture-raised cows, pigs, and chickens from family-owned farms? So me personally, I was a vegetarian for like 12 years. I gave it up when I moved to Korea. I lived in Korea for a year, then I lived in the Czech Republic for a while. So I was living abroad for a while, and I couldn't really handle being a vegetarian abroad very well in a country that I didn't really speak the language. So I did give it up, and I haven't become vegetarian again since. However, I always try to eat meat that is from, pasture-raised local family farms whenever I can. I eat less meat, but I do still eat meat. But yeah, I think that's a really good approach. If we all just ate slightly less meat and made an effort to eat meat that, from animals that had decent lives that lived on a small family farm, then that would be ideal. Someday, I would even love to have my own land and be able to raise my own chickens. I think that would be really cool. Let's see. Yeah, great questions. Yeah, Emily says, I'm a vegetarian, but I also feel for the plants. No matter what we eat, we are taking life. So whatever you eat, as long as you are respectful and don't overtake, I don't see an issue personally. Yeah, definitely agree with that. Betwixt and Between says, as a species, we disrupt the harmony through overpopulation. I feel this is not addressed enough because as humans, we value our species above all others, and that is a problem. This is a really interesting question, and it's something I've thought about too. And I was even listening to a podcast the other day where they were talking about, I think it was The Argument. I was listening to the podcast called The Argument, and they were talking about how our birth rate's going down. And for me personally, I'm like, that's probably okay if our birth rate goes down a bit, because we just don't have 7 planets, right? If we did, we could keep growing for much longer. But ultimately, we are working with what we have here on this planet. And it's probably not going to be easy to regenerate and sustain the planet we have if we have, 10 billion people. But that's just my 2 cents on that. It's a great question. a lot behind it too. Let's see. Great questions, great comments. I did notice wow, it's already past 6. This has been such a great conversation. I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface. Maybe we'll have to talk about animism later on in another future episode of Pagan Happy Hour. Before we sign off, I did want to let you guys know that I am offering, sorry, I can't even speak right now. I guess that wine is getting to me. I do offer tarot readings and lessons. I don't know if you know this, but I'm not a full-time YouTuber. I do other things on the side. So if you are interested in learning tarot or getting a reading from me, I do have some spots available that opened up. So I have the links down below if you are interested in signing up. It's one-on-one through Zoom or Skype. So if you're interested in a reading or a lesson, check out those links down below. And again, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, that you found some value here, that you enjoyed the conversation and discussion. If you want to continue on with the discussion, I recommend joining my Patreon so you can gain access to the Discord community, which is a really fun group of fellow pagans. And that would be a great way to keep the chat going. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed yet, what are you doing? If you sat here and watched this for an hour, you should probably go click that subscribe button. And thank you guys again. I will see you next week for Pagan Happy Hour. Talk to you all later. Bye.